The bacon you bought at the grocery store last week is more chemistry experiment than food. The average package of supermarket bacon contains sodium nitrite, sodium erythorbate, sodium phosphates, sodium ascorbate, and between 3 and 6 other industrial additives that have nothing to do with curing meat and everything to do with extending shelf life on a refrigerated truck. According to USDA data, the average American household spends between $400 and $800 a year on processed pork products alone. Over 30 years, that is between $12,000 and $24,000 on cured meat that bears almost no resemblance to what your great-grandfather ate. And in 1998, the United States Department of Agriculture issued a guidance document that effectively pushed traditional dry-cured smokehouse meat out of the legal commercial classification entirely. $10. That is what a 64-year-old retired hardware store owner named Caleb Stiltner spent on the wooden smokehouse he uses to cure 30 hogs every year for his family and his neighbors outside Berea, Kentucky. Not $10 a year, $10 total. The lumber was scrap from the old hardware store he ran from 1989 to 2019. The hardware was bolts and a galvanized chimney pipe he already had. The total out-of-pocket cost was $10.43 at a paint store for a small can of food-grade beeswax to seal the joints. I'm standing inside the smokehouse right now. The walls are pine board lined with cedar inside. The smell is something between hickory smoke and ham, and something I cannot name because the supermarket meat I have been buying for 40 years has had every trace of it scrubbed out by industrial processing. The processed meat industry has spent 30 years making sure you never taste the difference. After the last video on Otis Pennington and the spring house outside Sparta, Tennessee, hundreds of you wrote in asking the same thing. You said, "Earl, the cold storage is fine, but what about the meat itself? What about the bacon? What about a country ham that does not come from a grocery store? Tell me about the smokehouse." So I drove 4 hours north from Sparta through the Cumberland Gap and east into the hardwood country outside Berea, Kentucky, up a gravel road that ends at a wooden gate with a hand-painted sign reading Stiltner Farm, 1898. And what I found on Caleb's land is a building design that the Scots-Irish immigrants brought across the Atlantic in the 1740s, that the Cherokee adapted from older patterns going back 2,000 years before that, and that the USDA pushed out of legal commercial food classification in a single guidance document issued in 1998. This works on a 5-acre lot. It works in a suburban backyard with one modification I will explain. It works in any climate cool enough for the meat to dry without spoiling. You don't need to raise your own hogs. You can buy fresh pork from any local farmer for a fraction of what processed bacon costs at the store. The smokehouse handles the rest. Before this video is over, 3 things are going to land on you. First, I am going to walk you through Caleb's exact build. The dimensions, the wood, the cedar lining, the airflow system, the firebox in the ground 6 feet from the building, $10 in materials, 1 weekend of work. I will show you the part most folks get wrong that turns a perfect smokehouse into a fire hazard. Second, I am going to tell you about a 1925 USDA Farmer's Bulletin titled Pork on the Farm, Killing, Curing, and Canning. That bulletin documented this exact smokehouse design across 217 southern farms. It included engineering drawings, cure recipes, smoking times, and food safety practices that had kept families fed without spoilage for 2 centuries. The bulletin was reprinted 17 times between 1925 and 1972. The last printing went out in 1972. I will name the year, I will name the agency, and I will name the corporations that benefited. Third, I am going to tell you about the USDA Food Safety Inspection Service Guidance Document, FSIS Directive 7110.3, issued in October 1998. The Kentucky State Meat Inspector who came to Caleb's farm in 1999, and what the inspector said about the country ham hanging in the smokehouse that day. Stay with me. None of this is hard. All of it works. Here is the number you ought to sit with for a second. The average American household over a 40-year stretch will spend between $16,000 and $32,000 on processed pork products alone. That number does not include the cost of nitrites and phosphates in the meat, that the World Health Organization has classified as Group 1 carcinogens in processed meat consumption studies. It does not include the cost of a refrigerator running 24 hours a day to hold meat that should not need refrigeration to stay safe. It does not include the cost of food spoilage from buying too much because it does not last long enough to use. Add those costs in, and the total cost of modern processed pork in an American household crosses $40,000 over a generation. I will tell you something. For 35 years, I lived in that brick ranch house in Akron, Ohio. I worked at the Goodyear plant on Wadsworth Street. Every week, I drove to the Acme Grocery on Cleveland-Massillon Road and bought a pound of bacon and a half pound of breakfast sausage and some kind of processed ham for sandwiches. I paid the going rate. I never asked what was in it. I figured pork is pork. My granddaddy Wendell raised 3 boys in that 4-room cabin outside Hazard, Kentucky. He never bought a slice of bacon at a grocery store in his life. Not in 1955, not in 1970, not in 1981 when he died at 83 years old. He butchered 2 hogs every November, cured them in a smokehouse his uncle had built in 1928, and ate his own ham, bacon, sausage, and side meat for the next 12 months. He died with a smokehouse full of cured meat hanging from hooks his grandfather had forged at a coal-fired blacksmith bellows in 1894. I thought my granddaddy was just country. That is what I told myself for 30 years. He was not country. He knew what was actually in food. And what he knew had been written down in a 1925 USDA bulletin that the federal government stopped reprinting 53 years ago. Let me tell you what is actually in your grocery store bacon, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Standard supermarket bacon goes through a process called wet curing, also called pickle injection. The pork belly gets injected with a brine solution containing sodium chloride, sodium nitrite, sodium erythorbate, sodium phosphates, sugar, and water. The injection happens in a factory at high pressure, forcing the brine deep into the meat in minutes. The pork belly then sits in a tumbling drum for 90 minutes to 4 hours to distribute the brine, then gets sliced and packaged within 24 hours of the hog being slaughtered. The whole process takes less than 2 days. Traditional dry-cured bacon, the kind Caleb makes, goes through a process called dry curing. The pork belly gets rubbed by hand with a mixture of salt, brown sugar, black pepper, and sometimes saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, the same compound that occurs naturally in celery, spinach, and beets. The belly hangs in a cool, dry place for 10 to 14 days while the salt draws moisture out of the meat. The meat then hangs in a smokehouse for 2 to 4 days over a slow, hard wood fire, picking up the smoke that gives the bacon its flavor and its preservation. The whole process takes 3 to 4 weeks. Here is the difference that matters. Wet-cured grocery store bacon is still about 60% water by weight. That is why a pound of supermarket bacon shrinks to almost nothing in the frying pan, and why it has to be refrigerated, and why it goes bad in a week if you leave it out. Dry-cured smokehouse bacon is about 35% water by weight. The salt and the smoke have penetrated the entire piece of meat, not just been injected into channels through it. A properly dry-cured slab of bacon hangs in a cool, dry room for a year and does not spoil. It does not need a refrigerator. It does not need preservatives beyond what the salt and the smoke already provide. The Cherokee people in these mountains figured out smoke curing long before any settlers got here. Archaeological surveys at Cherokee village sites in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina have documented smoke curing structures dating back to at least 700 CE. The Cherokees smoked venison, bear meat, fish, and wild turkey using small log-built smokehouses heated by smoldering fires of green hickory and oak. Same principle, same chemistry, different language. Every civilization that ever needed to preserve meat through a winter arrived at the same answer. The ancient Egyptians smoked fish in clay-roofed chambers along the Nile. As far back as 2500 BCE, tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom show workers hanging fish above smoldering fires of palm wood and date palm leaves. The smoked fish stored for months without refrigeration. The Romans built smoke chambers called fumeria into the basements of their farms for curing pork, fish, and game. Apicius, the Roman cooking compendium from the 1st century CE, describes specific cuts of pork shoulder cured with salt and smoked over juniper wood. The technique spread across the empire and survived its collapse. Modern Italian prosciutto, Spanish jamon, and German speck all descend directly from Roman smoke-curing traditions. The Vikings smoked herring, salmon, and pork over alder and birch in stone-built sauna-like structures that doubled as bathhouses in winter. Smoked Viking fish provisions sustained voyages from Norway to Iceland to Newfoundland between 800 and 1100 CE. Modern Scandinavian gravlax is the direct descendant. The Chinese smoke-cured pork over tea leaves, sugarcane, and rice straw during the Han Dynasty, starting around 200 BCE. The technique survives today as Hunan-style smoked pork. The Korean smoked pork belly over oak and pine. The Japanese smoke-cured fish over straw in a process called katsuobushi that produced rock-hard dried bonito stored for years. The Inuit smoked seal and fish over driftwood and seal oil. Every culture that ever had hot summers and cold winters and wanted to eat meat in February when the snow was 3 feet deep figured out the same thing. Salt draws out the water. Smoke kills the bacteria. Time finishes the work. The Scots, Irish, and German settlers who came into Appalachia between 1730 and 1810 brought European smoke-curing traditions with them. They built simplified versions of the German Räucherkammer out of native pine and oak. They cured pork the way their grandfathers in Ulster and the Rhineland had cured pork. By 1850, every farm in the Appalachian range had a smokehouse. The design survived for 200 years because nobody up here had a reason to abandon it. Then, between 1906 and 1998, a series of federal regulations gradually pushed the home smokehouse out of legal commercial classification. The pattern is documented in the Federal Register. In 1906, the Federal Meat Inspection Act required federal inspection of any meat sold across state lines. In 1957, the Poultry Products Inspection Act extended federal oversight to poultry. In 1967, the Wholesome Meat Act extended inspection requirements to meat sold within state lines, ending the era of the local butcher who could sell to neighbors without federal certification. In 1972, the USDA stopped reprinting the 1925 Farmer's Bulletin on home pork curing. The bulletin moved to closed stacks archives at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. In October 1998, the USDA Food Safety Inspection Service issued FSIS Directive 7110.3, titled Critical Operational Parameters for Ready-to-Eat Meat and Poultry Products. The directive established processing temperature requirements, moisture-protein ratios, and water activity thresholds for commercially sold cured meats. The standards were written for industrial production. They were not designed for traditional dry-cured smokehouse products, which routinely fall outside the directive's parameters because the curing chemistry is different. A traditional Kentucky country ham aged for 12 months in a smokehouse has a water activity around 0.85 and a moisture-protein ratio around 1.8 to 1. The 1998 directive set the upper limit for commercial sale at a water activity below 0.91 and a moisture-protein ratio specific to factory processes. The traditional ham met the safety profile. It did not meet the paperwork profile. The result was that a Kentucky farmer who had been selling country ham to his neighbors for 50 years could no longer legally do so for commercial sale outside of a tightly regulated exception window for state-inspected facilities. The product had not changed. The science had not changed. The classification had changed. The numbers tell you why the agencies cared. The processed meat industry in the United States is worth approximately $320 billion a year. Smithfield Foods, Tyson Foods, JBS USA, and Hormel together produce roughly 70% of all commercial pork products sold in the country. The lifetime value of a single processed meat customer to those 4 companies across a 40-year household consumption period is between $24,000 and $48,000. Every household that cures its own meat in a backyard smokehouse is a customer those 4 companies never see. A package of bacon never bought. A pound of breakfast sausage never sold. A holiday ham that comes off a hook in a shed instead of off a shelf at the grocery store. In June 1999, the Kentucky Department of Agriculture sent a state meat inspector to Caleb Stiltner's farm in response to a question about whether he could sell ham to a local restaurant. The inspector arrived in the morning. He walked the property. He examined the smokehouse, the firebox, the curing room, and the hanging ham from the previous winter. He tested the cured meat for water activity and moisture content. The results came back showing water activity of 0.84 and a moisture-protein ratio of 1.7 to 1, well within traditional country ham parameters and well outside FSIS Directive 7110.3 commercial standards. The inspector wrote in his report that the ham was safe for household consumption and traditional gift exchange, but could not be legally sold to a commercial restaurant. He then asked Caleb if he could try a slice. He cut a thin slice from the hanging ham with his own pocket knife. He chewed it slowly. Then he asked for a second slice. Caleb still has the inspector's report. I read it. I photographed the state seal. The story is real. Now, if you are sitting there thinking this only works if you have 5 acres and a hog operation, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. I built a small version of Caleb's smokehouse in the backyard of my house in Akron in 2019, the year before I sold the place and moved back to Kentucky. The structure was 3 feet by 3 feet by 6 feet tall, built out of pine boards I cut with a circular saw from 1 sheet of 3/4-inch plywood. The firebox was a small steel box buried in the ground 6 feet from the smokehouse, connected to the smokehouse by a length of galvanized stovepipe running through a shallow trench. Total cost in materials, including the stovepipe and 1 box of decking screws, was $63. I cured my first pork belly in that smokehouse in November 2019. The pork came from a Mennonite farmer in Holmes County, Ohio, for $1.40 a pound, less than half the price of grocery store bacon. I salted the belly for 14 days. I smoked it for 3 days over hickory chips. The finished bacon hung in my unheated garage through January and February. My wife and I ate it through March. It tasted nothing like grocery store bacon. The flavor was deeper and smokier and saltier and more interesting than anything I had ever bought from a refrigerated case. You don't need a farm. You need a corner of a yard, a few sheets of lumber, a length of stovepipe, and the willingness to read a 1925 USDA bulletin that has been sitting in an archive for 52 years. Here is what Caleb's exact smokehouse looks like, because the design is worth understanding in detail. The building is 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 7 feet tall at the peak of the roof. The walls are tongue-and-groove pine boards, salvaged from the back room of the hardware store he closed in 2019. The interior is lined with 1x6 cedar planks that absorb moisture and give off natural antibacterial compounds. The roof is corrugated metal that he installed himself in 2008 to replace the original wood shingles. The floor is hand-poured concrete from 1958. The door is solid oak with iron hinges his grandfather forged in 1936. The firebox sits in the ground, 6 feet from the smokehouse, dug into a sloped bank for easy access. The firebox is a 15-inch deep pit lined with brick, covered by an iron lid. A 4-inch galvanized stovepipe runs underground through a brick-lined trench from the firebox to the base of the smokehouse, entering through a brick-lined opening near the floor. The reason for the distance between firebox and smokehouse is the part most folks get wrong. If you build the fire inside the smokehouse, the meat cures too fast at too high a temperature, and you end up with cooked meat that spoils within months. If you put the firebox right next to the smokehouse with a short pipe, the same thing happens. The 6-foot underground pipe gives the smoke and hot gases time to cool to between 90 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit by the time they enter the smokehouse. That cool smoke cures the meat over days without cooking it. That is the entire difference between a smokehouse that works and one that ruins 30 pounds of pork. Let me tell you a little more about Caleb, because the numbers he runs on are the kind of numbers that make every pork producer in the Midwest nervous. Caleb Stiltner is 64 years old. He ran Stiltner Hardware in downtown Berea from 1989 to 2019, when he sold the building to a young couple who turned it into a coffee shop. He took the proceeds and finished paying off his farm. The Stiltner family has farmed this land since 1898. His grandfather built the smokehouse in 1936, using lumber salvaged from a sawmill in nearby Renfro Valley. Caleb has used the smokehouse continuously since he took over the farm from his father in 1992. He cures 30 hogs every year. He raises 10 of them himself on his 5 acres. The other 20 come from his 3 neighbors, who pay him in hogs and labor for the use of his smokehouse. The arrangement is a barter system. He provides the building, the wood, the salt, and the labor. The neighbors provide their hogs and their help on butchering day. Everyone goes home with a full year of cured meat at the end of the season. He showed me his pantry the day I visited. Hanging from a beam in the back room of the kitchen, 4 whole country hams aged 12 to 14 months, 8 slabs of bacon aged 6 to 8 months. 12 coils of dry-cured sausage aged 3 to 6 months, and 6 pork shoulders aged 10 months. The total retail value of the cured meat hanging in that room, if he had bought it at a specialty market, was around $2,800. His total cost for the meat in raw pork and curing materials, about $300 in salt, pepper, and his share of the butchering labor. I asked him how he learned the trade. He said his father taught him in 1976 when he was 16 years old. His father had learned from his own father, who had built the smokehouse in 1936. 3 generations, 1 building, 1 technique, 1 ham, hanging on a hook for a year before it gets sliced. I sat with him in the kitchen at the back of the farmhouse and ate a slice of his country ham that he cut from a 1-year-old leg. The taste was nothing like any ham I'd ever eaten before. It was salty in a way grocery ham is not. It was nutty. It had a faint sweetness from the brown sugar in the cure, and a depth from the hickory smoke that filled the whole room. When he opened the smokehouse door, I ate 3 slices. Then I asked for a 4th. He walked me through his curing calendar. Butchering happens in early November, when the air temperatures finally drop into the low 40s at night. The hogs come from his 10 and from his neighbor's 20 over the course of 2 long Saturdays. Salting starts the same day. Each cut gets rubbed by hand with a mix Caleb keeps in a wooden barrel inside the curing room. 48 parts salt, 12 parts brown sugar, 1 part black pepper, half a part saltpeter. The cuts hang on hooks for 12 to 15 days, while the salt draws the moisture out. Then the smoking starts. Caleb keeps a small smoldering fire of hickory and applewood burning in the underground firebox for 8 to 12 hours at a stretch, 3 days running. After the smoke, the meat hangs for the rest of the year. Country ham comes off the hook at 12 months. Bacon comes off at 6. Sausage at 3. The cycle starts again the next November. He showed me the salt barrel inside the curing room, hand-lettered in his grandfather's handwriting on the side of the barrel. Stiltner Cure, 1936. The same recipe, 88 years, 3 generations. He told me he has not changed the proportions by a single ounce. I stood inside the smokehouse for 20 minutes. The walls were dark from 88 years of accumulated smoke. The cedar lining still gave off a faint resinous smell. Above my head, 4 whole country hams hung from hooks his grandfather had forged in 1936. I touched one. The outside was dry and hard, like leather. Caleb told me when he slices into it, the inside will be ruby red and tender, with a marbled fat that has spent 12 months absorbing the smoke and the salt and the slow work of time. There is no refrigerator in the building. There has never been a refrigerator in the building. The room held a steady 58 degrees in November and a steady 70 degrees in August, year after year, for almost a century. And then he told me about the modification his grandfather added to the smokehouse in 1947 that I never would have figured out on my own. After the last few videos, hundreds of you wrote in, asking if I had all of this in one place. The cabin, cooling, the water filter, the masonry heater, the spring house, and now the smokehouse. So I put it together. Every system I have documented from these mountain folks is in one guide, step by step, for any house already built, no new construction required. The link is in the description below this video, but stay here because the modification Caleb's grandfather added in 1947 is the part that lets this work in places without a 6-foot underground firebox trench. That 1925 USDA Farmer's Bulletin I mentioned, the one on pork curing, there was a section on page 47 titled Smoke Cooling Through Above Ground Coils for Compact Smokehouse Sites. The section documented a modification that German farmers in Pennsylvania had been using since at least 1880 for properties where digging an underground trench was impractical. The modification was a coil of galvanized stovepipe, 16 feet long, mounted on the outside of the smokehouse wall in a spiral. Hot smoke from a firebox smokeroosedan attached at the base of the coil traveled upward through the 16 feet of exposed galvanized pipe, losing heat to the open air before entering the smokehouse near the roof at the cool 90 to 110-degree range. Caleb's grandfather built a small auxiliary smokehouse with this above-ground coil design in 1947 for his daughter, who lived in town on a quarter-acre lot where digging a trench was not an option. The auxiliary smokehouse still stands. Caleb's cousin Edna lives in the same house now and uses the building every November for her family's pork curing. The total construction cost of the above-ground coil system in 1947 was about $35. The cost today, with new galvanized stovepipe, is about $90, including a small steel firebox. $90 for a system that produces 20 years of cured ham, bacon, and sausage from a quarter-acre suburban lot. The math is not subtle. I'm going to tell you something straight. I spent 35 years in that house in Akron buying grocery store bacon and ham every week, without ever asking what was in it. About $15,000 over a working lifetime on processed pork products that bore almost no resemblance to what my own grandfather had hanging in his smokehouse the day he died. My granddaddy Wendell never bought a slice of bacon, not because he was poor, not because he was country, because he knew what was actually in food. He knew what salt and smoke and thyme and hardwood and patience could do to a hog. He knew what his great-grandfather had known. The knowledge was never lost. It was set aside, pulled out of a USDA bulletin in 1972, pushed out of the legal commercial market by a federal directive in 1998 that named 4 corporate beneficiaries, replaced by $320 billion in annual processed meat sales, and a generation of Americans who have never tasted real, cured pork. The lumber is still at the lumber yard. The hickory is still in your woods. The salt is still at the grocery store. The smokehouse Caleb's grandfather built in 1936 still hangs ham in 2024, the way it has every year for 88 years running. The only thing that changed is whether anybody told you about it. Now you know. Drop your state in the comments. Tell me what you spend on bacon and ham in a year. And if your grandfather or anyone in your family ever cured meat in a backyard smokehouse, I want to hear that story. There are thousands of these buildings still standing in the southern hills. Most of them are still being used by people the federal government has spent decades trying to make invisible. You leaving a comment is how we keep them from disappearing. Hit subscribe if you want to keep digging these things up with me before they are gone for good. The folks who taught me this are in their 70s and 80s. We do not have a lot of time. Next week, I am driving 3 hours north into the farm country, outside Spencer, West Virginia, to meet a 69-year-old retired school teacher named Wyatt Mullins, who has not bought a single vegetable from a grocery store in 15 straight winters. Not one potato, not one onion, not one carrot. He stores 600 pounds of garden produce every fall in a $20 root cellar his great-uncle dug into a hillside in 1928. The USDA tried to classify his storage method as inadequate for safe long-term consumption in 1991 and walked it back when the local extension agent tested the produce and found it fresher than the bag of carrots at the IGA. I will see you there.